And we have this, the format of making visible is under the format of mindfulness, but you don't have to be a practitioner to be here. We are just doing and following this format. It's easy, and we will, as Annie told you, we will have the bell and we will read a quote, but you don't have to be a practitioner. And again, thank you everyone for being here. And as a reminder, we have closed captioning live. So if you want to have the closed captioning, don't just put the instruction in the chat.
So what do you think? Shall we begin with a bell?
How many?
What do you think?
Yes, maybe it's time. No, let's start with a bell.
Okay. So it's interesting, the topic tonight being Asian American and Asian Pacific Islanders, and around Buddhism in particular, and me being an American, a white American, using the bell. I just want to point out that this bell, this particular bell, actually I purchased, but the idea of inviting the bell comes from the teacher that I've practiced with, Thich Nhat Hanh, and it is an Asian practice. And I just want to honor that a lot of times we're doing these things that we don't mention where they came from, but that is where this comes from. And the way that we invite the bell here is from Thich Nhat Hanh and the Plum Village tradition. So I'll just share that as we begin. So we'll have 3 sounds of the bell, and this will be a chance for us just to settle into our seats and to arrive in our bodies so that we can be more present to Chenzing and to each other, and to really be here together. And Adriana is going to read a quote from Thich Nhat Hanh that Chenzing selected for us this evening. And I'm going to turn it over to Adriana.
Sorry, I'm here. Thank you, Annie. If you're a young Asian American raised with the American culture, open your heart and learn about your original roots and the country of your parents and grandparents. Growing up in the United States, you have received a culture, an education, a way of caring of your activities, but do not think that it is superior. Thich Nhat Hanh. Thank you. And now Annie is gonna introduce Chenzing. We are really honored to have her with us, and I hope all of you enjoy this night this topic tonight. Thank you, Annie.
Thank you, Adriana, so much. And yes, we are so excited. I learned about Chenzing through a couple of people, one of whom is on this call, and also Katie Lank from the Buddhist Peace Fellowship. And this book, Be the Refuge, that I was so excited to, I see other people holding it up, yes. I was so excited to read the subtitle, Raising the Voices of Asian American Buddhists. And I'm going to read Chenzing's bio. So Chenzing Han is a Bay Area-based writer whose publications have appeared in Buddha Dharma, Journal of Global Buddhism, Lion's Roar, Pacific World, Tricycle, and elsewhere. She holds a BA from Stanford and an MA in Buddhist Studies from the Graduate Theological Union. After studying chaplaincy at the Institute of Buddhist Studies in Berkeley, she worked in spiritual care at a nearby community hospital in Oakland. This is her first book, Be the Refuge, Raising the Voices of Asian American Buddhists, which was published by North Atlantic Books in January 2021. So, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Chenzing, and we're so thankful that you could be here, and we look forward to hearing everything that you have to share.
Thank you so much, Annie. I just first want to thank you and Adriana for co-organizing this event. I want to thank Rachel for helping to spread the word, and also Dawn for doing live closed captioning. I also want to acknowledge I'm speaking to you all from the Bay Area, about 10 minutes south of San Francisco Airport on the unceded ancestral lands of the Salsan community, speakers of the Ramaytush dialect of the Ohlone Costanoan language. And it's really delightful to see all of you here. Let me see if I can put on gallery view so I don't have to look at myself. Thank you all for taking the time just to be here today for the Making Visible community. Thanks, Katie. I don't think she's here, but I'm grateful to her for connecting me with this series, and also grateful to An Tran and David Wu, who will be speaking in June and July. And I see some familiar faces here and lots of new friends as well. So welcome, and thank you so much for your kind attention. So today is a bit of an experiment. For most of my book events over the past 3.5 months, I've usually been in dialogue. And so this is the first time I'll be doing maybe a little bit more of a presentation. And I think first though, before I dive in and start sharing my screen, I know some of you have your videos on. I'm curious to know, I suppose first, how many of you have been able to read some or all of my book, are familiar with it? Oh, wonderful. Thank you all so much. Okay, so quite a few of you. And then I wonder, last week there was a May 4th gathering of a National Buddhist Memorial Ceremony for Asian American ancestors that I want to talk about today. And I'm wondering how many people here were able to attend the live stream or watch the video afterward. Also quite a few people. Thank you so much for joining us. So when I was thinking about what to share, and I was thinking about how this series is called Making Visible, I'm not actually a very big visual person myself. I'm perhaps more auditory, or I'm very drawn to smell and other senses, and of course the written word. But I thought it might be nice to share some images. So I started gathering those. And I know I sort of promised a journey through Be the Refuge, and both the writing of the whole writing process, also the themes within the book, and then also kind of what it's been like to publish this book during a pandemic, during a time when there's been rising anti-Asian violence. And it occurred to me actually that, as one of my interviewees said, you connect the dots in retrospect. So I think I will actually kind of go backwards in time. So I want to begin with May We Gather. And I invite you during this time to, if you want to, write in the chat, please do so. In particular, if some of you are moved to share what it was like for you to watch the May We Gather event, to attend, just please feel free to write in the chat, just as another way to interact. And if you just want to focus on what I'm saying, that's wonderful too. So I'm going to share my screen, and I think we can just dive in. So just give me a moment to set that up. Is everyone seeing an image of, maybe we got it. Okay, perfect. So, like I said, May We Gather was a National Buddhist Memorial Ceremony for Asian American ancestors that occurred, I guess, just 8 days ago on May 4th, 2021. I never would have imagined having the honor to co-organize such a ceremony. It was incredible that over 1,700 people joined us during the live stream, and the video has been watched more than 7,000 times. So thank you all for participating in this ceremony. We were really moved to see a lot of media coverage of this event, including in the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times. It's so rare to see just Buddhists acknowledged at all, but especially to see Asian American Buddhists acknowledged in this national way was incredibly powerful. I know for myself, and I know for many other people. So for those of you who attended, a little bit of this will be a review. And for those of you who didn't attend, the video is available at the website maywegather.org. And something I just want to draw your attention to here is just these masks that everyone is wearing. I think it was a really powerful symbol of our desire to protect each other during this time, that we had to have a socially distanced and safe ceremony that we would have loved to have many more people attend, but it wasn't quite possible yet at this point in the pandemic. We opened with a beautiful procession of the approximately 49 different Buddhist monastics and priests, most of whom were of Asian heritage, but some of whom were our allies or spiritual friends who joined us. The procession was led by Reverend Kojima, who actually handmade every single one of these masks and did the calligraphy. He's a master calligrapher. And the writing on the masks says homage to the three jewels that we take refuge in as Buddhas, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So our main organizer, Reverend Duncan Ryukin Williams, helped open the ceremony with what's called a hyobyakumon. So this was actually a statement before the Buddha to let people know about the intention of this gathering. And this gathering really, as I mentioned, rose in response to the rise of anti-Asian violence, in particular after the Atlanta shootings that really just shocked the nation and the world, and certainly affected us three as co-organizers. We wanted to know, what is a way that we can really respond to this, to meet the magnitude of the pain and the suffering and the sense of isolation and fear that so many of us, particularly in the Asian American community, feel, and how can we do this in a way that really centers Asian American Buddhist voices, which presently and also historically have so often been marginalized and erased. So I was one of the co-MCs for the event, along with Dr. Funi Su, who's a professor at San Jose State. And I'll mention Funi and Duncan a little bit later in this sharing of images as well. One of the central aspects of our ceremony were these memorial tablets, 7 of them in all. And Reverend Kojima, who made the masks, also did the calligraphy for these tablets. We wanted to select just a few of the names of Asian American Buddhists who've died at the hands of anti-Asian and also anti-religious violence. So at the rightmost, we see the name of Yong-ae Yu, a Korean American Buddhist who was killed in the Atlanta shootings. And it's a little hard to see in the pictures here, but the calligraphy beneath indicates the names when they passed away. And to the left of Yong-ae Yu is Wichao Ratanapakdi, a Thai American Buddhist who was assaulted and killed in January of this year while taking a walk in a San Francisco neighborhood. To his left is Tommy Lay, who was killed by police. And so we're going back in time here. He was killed by police for holding a pen, knocking on a door and holding a pen, though it was claimed he was holding a knife. And then I'll skip a tablet, I'll skip the central tablet and mention Tien Min Lee. This was a couple of decades ago now, who was in his 20s, and he was violently, brutally murdered by white supremacists in Southern California, actually at the high school where Funi went to high school. So this was an instance of anti-Asian violence that touches very close to her heart. And then to the left, we go even further back in history to World War II to honor Kane Saburo Shima, who was shot by guards in a Japanese American incarceration camp when during World War II, more than 120,000 Japanese Americans just in the United States were incarcerated. This happened also in Canada and elsewhere. And Duncan has researched extensively on this. I highly recommend his book, American Sutra, for those who want to learn more about this history. And it's his research that brings us the stories of people like Kane Saburo Oshima, whose granddaughter was actually attending the ceremony with us from Daifukuji in Hawaii. And then in the very leftmost, we have a tablet honoring Siap Banning, who was one of 28 people massacred in 1885 in Wyoming of Chinese miners. Her body was burned and her head and neck and shoulders were found near a hut there in the village. So at the very center, because it's of course impossible to include all of the names, and in fact, many of names are lost to history. And also we wanted to remind ourselves to remember that Asian American Buddhists are connected across ethnic traditions, but also connected to our spiritual friends, to our kin across racial boundaries, across religious boundaries, right? So soon after the Atlanta shootings, so many people who are sick were killed in Indianapolis, part of those shootings. So we just feel the hurt and wanted to acknowledge all beings who've lost their lives through racial and religious animus. So as part of the ceremony, many of the monastics and priests and lay leaders present gave offerings of light, of candles here, also of incense. You can see the incense burners. And here I should go back and just acknowledge that this is Geshe Punso from the Gadeshatse Tupten Dargiling Monastery. And these photos are also available at the May We Gather website and the gallery. So here's some additional media coverage. This is from the Renjie Tongxun Se, or the Life News Agency newspaper. And we can see the 6 speakers who gave brief Dharma talks on the 6 paramitas. These are the 6 perfections, the perfected qualities of enlightened beings within Buddhism. So we can see that Bishop Nori Ito, who's also the bishop of Higashi Honganji Temple, here at the top left, he gave a Dharma talk on Prajna Paramita, or wisdom. And I was very moved when he shared that he, for a few years, was able to actually lead the temple along with his father. And his father, when parishioners, when members of this temple, this Sangha, would pass away, he would actually do a ceremony every week for the 49 days. And that would give him an occasion for each week to speak on one of the paramitas. So Bishop Ito had himself a very personal connection, and that's partly the reason why we chose to feature 6 speakers. And also because we really wanted to highlight some of the Buddhist teachings that we can root ourselves in and take inspiration from during this time when there has been so much trauma, so much violence. Our second speaker was Sister Gingyam of Deer Park Monastery. Perhaps some of you know her, and she spoke on Shila Paramita, sort of you can translate Shila many ways, but we can think about ethics or appropriate conduct. And then we had a Dharma talk in Spanish by Bhante Sanata Vihari of Sarachandra Buddhist Center on Kshanti Paramita, or patience. And it was just so powerful for me to hear this Dharma talk in Spanish, which is unfortunately not a language that I know, but spoken by a monastic who's primarily serving at a Sri Lankan Buddhist temple in Southern California, but it's a temple that also serves the Thai American community. Just another reminder of how incredibly interconnected our American Buddhist Sangha is. And then Bishop Myoke Kane Barrett of Myokenji Temple of Nichiren Buddhist Sangha of Texas, who really wanted to be with us in person, but unfortunately wasn't able to come. She gave a Dharma message that was pre-recorded on Dhyana Paramita, or meditation, concentration. And then Reverend Christina Moon flew all the way from Hawaii to join us. And she gave a Dharma talk very fittingly for her practice on virya, kind of spiritual energy. And Reverend Moon is a member of, she leads at Daihonzan Chozenji International Zen Dojo in Hawaii. And then finally, Dr. Larry Ward of the Lotus Institute. Again, many of you may know him because he's deeply connected to Thich Nhat Hanh's tradition. He gave a talk on Dana Paramita, on generosity. And many of us commented how we were quite delighted that he was able to go off script. So most of these talks had been scripted beforehand in order to have captioning, but Dr. Ward really spoke from the heart to our audience. And another central element of our ceremony was this lotus. And as we know, the lotus is such a central symbol in many Buddhist traditions. We think of the lotus as a symbol of enlightenment, but it rises from muddy roots, right, from these muddied waters. And so actually a lotus can't grow in pure water. It's a reminder that it's possible for us to transform our suffering, our pain into something beautiful. And this lotus was handmade for us, handmade in sort of 10 days in a very compressed amount of time. Um, so we can admire what the lotus looks like from the beginning, before it was painted. And during the ceremony, some monastics came and gently gilded some of these cracks in the lotus. So we called this lotus a Kimsuki Lotus. This was something that Duncan has spoken often about. Kintsugi is a Japanese art of, literally kin is gold and tsugi comes from tsugu, to join or to repair. And it's this idea that for us, what we wanted to highlight is that we didn't want to just hide our pain, but we wanted to acknowledge and name it, to have us be able to see it, but to honor it in a way that, you know, this gilding, which is also done in many Buddhist traditions, the gilding of Buddha statues, the placing of gold leaf bit by bit to watch a statue turn from, you know, not, let's say, just something without color to something that gleams. That was also to us a powerful symbol that we wanted to show how we heal together in community. So after the ceremony, we have Reverend Moon and Reverend Kojima and Reverend Williams together helping to paint the rest of the lotus. So here it is in its completed form there at Higashi Honganji Temple. And then another part of the ceremony was in our closing. We had a closing procession, and those of you who attended might have noticed people entered one by one into the procession, but exited in pairs. And they were all connected by this parita thread. This thread, we drew inspiration from Theravada Buddhist traditions that use this thread. So the thread is actually, you can't quite see in the picture, but you can see Amida Buddha in the very back, and the thread is connected to the Buddha. And it's a reminder that we are all connected to the Buddha, to his teachings, and to the Sangha. And so traditionally in a parita ceremony, if we had had time during the ceremony, we would have had the monastics who were chanting, bless the thread. The thread was empowered. So we did do that aspect. But what we didn't do was cut bits of thread so that around each person so that they could wear it around their wrist. In, I think, about a week or so, I'll be in conversation with Dr. Nalika Gajawira for the Harvard Buddhist community. And we were talking just a few weeks ago, and I was commenting actually on the parita thread on her wrist. And part of that conversation actually inspired me to say, you know, why don't we make sure we have parita as part of this ceremony? So really the ceremony was a historic ceremony. Nothing like it had ever been done before. It was certainly very moving for me to see so many different Asian American Buddhist traditions represented in one place and represented at a temple, Higashi Honganji, that had been vandalized, you know, just a few months prior, back in February of this year. So there was reporting in Lion's Roar on the event. And something that really struck me about this reporting was who the reporters were. So we have Mihiri Tilakaratne, who is in my book, Be the Refuge, was an inspiration for my book. And also Nancy Chu, who's a Taiwanese American Buddhist, also a PhD student at Stanford University. And to have an event and then have it be reported by Asian American Buddhist women is not something I would have imagined was possible maybe even 10 years ago when I really started to do the research for my book. So that in and of itself was deeply moving. And Mihiri and Nancy are two of the new associate editors at Lion's Roar, along with Pamela Ayo Yatund, who some people here may know. She's been doing a lot of work around the Buddhist Justice Reporter and highlighting Black Buddhists, and she's also one of the contributors to the anthology Black and Buddhist. So I'm just really glad to see that Lion's Roar, the staff is diversifying and is really committed to showcasing more broadly the diversity of American Buddhism. And then I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge Rob Sato, who did our illustration for this event, May We Gather. He was able to capture the lotuses, including Kintsugi moon. As we know in Buddhist traditions, the moon is also very often an image, a metaphor that we use, particularly in Zen traditions. And of course, all of these people. And for me, I love the vibrancy of the colors in this image because it actually reminds me of spending time in Laos and Thailand and Cambodia, particularly around the New Year, where people dress in their finest embroidery. And so to me, it reminds me of these Buddhist holidays where people are wearing this incredibly colorful and just beautiful embroidered dresses and embroidered. And so there was, I think, I guess the colors to me are a reminder that sometimes I think Buddhism can be stereotyped as very drab or dull, or it's just black and gray. But for me, there was both so much mourning in our ceremony, of course, so much grief. There was a very somber note, but there was also a lot of, literal color and a lot of almost an element of celebration in that we were reminding ourselves of our strength and our resilience that's rooted in our Buddhist practices, in our Buddhist teachings, and in our Buddhist communities. So this was, last week, just last week, the May 4th ceremony. And now going back a little bit in time, I want to take us back to January of this year. This is when I was able to launch my book, Be the Refuge. And I had no idea how this book would be received. It's the first book to really talk about Asian American Buddhists as a pan-ethnic and pan-Buddhist category. As we can see from May 4th, we come from many different countries. We trace our heritages to many different countries, and we practice in so many different Buddhist traditions. During May 4th, we had chanting from a Sri Lankan group. We had chanting in Pali, so from the Sri Lankan group, but also at the end from a Thai Buddhist group. We had chanting in Chinese of the Heart Sutra and chanting of the very same Heart Sutra in Korean. We had chanting from the Tibetan monastics, and that's just some of the many other chants we could have had. For example, Vietnamese Buddhist chants are so beautiful. I mean, there are so many Buddhist chants in our community. And so in 90 minutes, there was only so much we could include. So I think we also want to acknowledge that, all of the different communities that weren't able to join us. The Burmese and Laotian communities, for example, sent their blessings, but unfortunately weren't able to come because of limitations of distance. So, of course, I had no idea May 4th was going to happen back in January when my book launched. And what was really an honor was to be invited, for example, by Annie and Adriana for events like this one all over the US and even in Canada as well. So these are a list of just some of the events that I've been able to do. And I thought I would actually, this is my first time in an event reflecting just on these past 3.5 months. It was quite fun for me to think back over some of the events. And some of the recordings for the events are available if you go to my website on the events page. So here we are now in this Making Visible series. My next event will be at the Buddhist Church of Oakland. And I thought it might be fun actually to just highlight the 4 parts of my book. Here you can see trailblazers, bridge builders, integrators, and refuge makers. And I thought I'd highlight the 4 parts of my book, but through the lens of some of the events that I've done actually over the past 3 months. So part 1, trailblazers, and I'll just read this quote by Gabrielle, one of my interviewees. This is the inspiration for the title of this part of the book. I often feel like I am trailblazing how to incorporate Buddhism into life. So the trailblazer section of my book is really honoring what I call multi-generational Asian American Buddhists whose families have been in this country for generations, have been Buddhists in America for multiple generations, who can trace, often their temples were established, in the 19th century, in the early 20th century. Many are celebrating their centenaries now. So because of that, it felt really fitting to do my book launch at the Institute of Buddhist Studies. Here I'm with Scott Mitchell, my master's thesis advisor, as well as Harry Bridge, who's the reverend who leads the Buddhist Church of Oakland. And the Institute of Buddhist Studies, here it is in Berkeley, California, 2140 Durant. I write about it in the book, actually. So those of you who've read from, I think it's in chapter 1, it's in the first part of the book. And I talk about this Dharma wheel, the inside of the lobby of the Jodo Shinshu Center. So this, not this exact building, but this building now houses this exact building is not very old, but the history of what went into making this building possible has very deep roots. And the Institute of Buddhist Studies, where I did a certificate in Buddhist chaplaincy connected to my master's program at the Graduate Theological Union, it's a Buddhist seminary that's been around since 1949, training ministers in the Jodo Shinshu tradition, a predominantly Japanese American tradition, but a tradition that is rapidly diversifying, since Japanese Americans are among the groups that are the most multiracial and multi-ethnic, among the Asian American groups that are the most multiracial and multi-ethnic here in the US. And I write in the book about the statue of Shinran and how, to my mortification, when I first visited the Institute of Buddhist Studies, I didn't know who this was. I didn't know about Shin Buddhism. I'd read about Pure Land in a college course, but I didn't know it was such a living tradition. And not just that, that it was so foundational to Buddhism in America. So I'm quite excited to be doing a half-day retreat with the Young Buddhist Editorial, a group of young adult Jodo Shin Buddhists, a little bit later this month. And I just wanted to highlight that, again, this has all just happened in the past few months. It's been really extraordinary to see young adult Asian American Buddhists lifted more in the mainstream media. Here's a Washington Post article about the Young Buddhist editorial. And then while I was gathering these materials for our gathering here today together, I actually came across this that just posted a couple of days ago, a little video from NBC Today about young Buddhists. So I think we have time. I'm going to just play this video. It's only about 4.5 minutes long. And I think it just helps us just see some of the activism and work that younger Buddhists are doing. So I'm going to stop the share of this PowerPoint for a minute. And then I'm going to share this video. And I apologize if the video lags a little bit. Sometimes with Zoom, it's not perfect, but I hope you can be forgiving and still enjoy this video together.
Welcome to Virtual Dharma School, where these K through 8th grade students from Tacoma, Washington meet every other Sunday to study Shin Buddhist teachings.
And repeat the Nembutsu with me. Namo Amida Butsu.
Retired elementary school teacher June Akito is the school's superintendent.
You know, teaching is kind of in my blood, but just in my career, I always believed in the activity, doing something makes it set into your head a little bit better than just hearing someone tell you about it.
Shin Buddhism is one of the largest sects of Buddhism in Japan and one of the most popular in the US. It stresses boundless compassion to all sentient beings. Experts believe the religion arrived in the US with the first wave of Japanese immigration around 1900, but kept a low profile because of racism and the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Akito's parents and 10 of her siblings spent 3 years in those camps, but her mother made sure to pass her religious traditions onto her daughter.
I started Dharma school in Tacoma, actually in 6th grade through high school, went to college, got married, had my kids, and then my mom died. And I needed something to help me explain what just happened. And it just brought me back to the temple.
A local group of Japanese American college grads in Seattle recites Nembutsu, one of their core practices meant to express gratitude for Amida Buddha, seen as the embodiment of truth. They've been reconnecting with their Buddhist culture over this past year.
After internment, a lot of our grandparents great-grandparents, they didn't want to appear different to an average American. So along with that, they didn't teach their kids Japanese. My first name is Trevor. It's not something like phonetically Japanese or something like that. My parents don't really speak Japanese. And one of the things they did keep was the Buddhism as a religion, which is why I think a lot of us cling to it very heavily, because it gives us a sense of cultural identity.
To foster that sense of connection, Trevor and his friend Devin Matsumoto formed the Young Buddhist Editorial. It's an online forum that launched in February 2020 as a space for young Asian American Buddhists to share their perspectives on the religion. Matsumoto is the group's president.
So we'll start off with these two. I actually was not really big into Buddhism until maybe my senior year of high school. I used to always tell my mom that when I turn 18, I'm going to become a Christian. And I think a lot of that was internalized racism. To be Buddhist wasn't very cool or very accepted. And it was around those times when I was like looking at who's talking about Buddhism in the United States. Most of the times it's not people who look like us, Asian Americans. It's usually more middle-class white men who have come into Buddhism later on in their life. We aren't being represented. We're not being seen.
Amid the recent spike of anti-Asian violence and hate, the Young Buddhist Editorial has become a space to discuss these traumas and raise awareness about social justice movements.
We've especially been emphasizing creating a space for people to come together and talk about their trauma that they've experienced.
Oftentimes in Buddhism, we're told we can't feel anger, we can't feel frustration, we can't feel rage. You know, we are human first. We are people first before we're Buddhists. So we have to understand that these emotions make us who we are.
The group infuses their discussions on race and the pandemic through the lens of Buddhist teachings.
One thing we really like to emphasize is interdependence. Everything is connected. Freedom comes with responsibility, and our responsibility to other people in our world, other people in our community, and other people who we've never interacted with.
Okay, Dharma School students, you know the drill.
Back at virtual Dharma School, the next generation of Buddhists is learning the guiding principles of this religion in hopes of creating a more compassionate world.
Put your hands together and gasho. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo.
Thank you for enjoying that video with me. It's very rare. I guess we can't quite go to movie theaters yet, or I haven't been anyway, so it's kind of fun to watch that with all of you. So I wanted to now move on to part 2 of my book, which I call Bridge Builders. And part 1 focused on multi-gen Buddhists, as I mentioned, and part 2 focused on what I call second-gen Buddhists. So these are people who are really the second generation in their family to be Buddhists in America, people whose parents immigrated to the US and raised them within the Buddhist faith. And this is a quote from Lorene, one of my interviewees, who writes, "The volunteers who are running the Buddhist youth group, we were that youth at one point. We are there because we think it's important. We're bridging that gap. We're creating that space." And these second-gen Buddhists, I think, need to navigate so many gaps in terms of language, generational differences in practice between themselves and their parents. And so it's been really fun actually to do some events that are really focused on the sorts of unique experiences and challenges that they are facing. So one event that I did was to visit with Professor Carolyn Chen's class on the second generation Asian American experience. And Professor Chen, I'll mention this a little later, was also one of the inspirations for my book, since she herself had written a book on Taiwanese American Buddhists as well as Taiwanese American Christians. And she had commented that she's long been wanting to have a book that she can teach actually in her undergraduate classrooms, where that people who are second generation, particularly Buddhists, might see their own experiences reflected rather than only exclusively seeing or predominantly seeing the voices of white converts, which as you saw in the video that I just showed, sometimes can become the ways that people imbibe Buddhism, come to get to know Buddhism. And then there can be this sense that, oh, my own more culturally inflected Buddhism is somehow inauthentic or not really real Buddhism, or somehow an inferior kind of Buddhism. So I was able to speak with Carolyn just quite recently, actually, in a book that was co-sponsored by several departments at UC Berkeley, but also at Eastwind Books in Berkeley. And this is really special for me because I still remember, probably, gosh, almost a couple of decades ago, first visiting Berkeley. I was in high school at the time, living in a suburb of Seattle and not very aware of Asian American history or issues at all. And then to come to Berkeley and realize there was a bookstore dedicated to Asian American writing, but a bookstore that you can kind of see here also includes books by people of color, writers of color, of other backgrounds, and a bookstore in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, with other different movements. So when we went, I got to sign books. This is the first place where I was actually able to sign books in person. And then, of course, I couldn't resist, coming home with a huge stack of books. And I was looking at that stack of books and I was thinking like, oh, well, this stack of books includes not just Asian American writers from different ethnic backgrounds, but also Black and Latinx writers. So, from this Asian American bookstore. So I mentioned Carolyn Chen, who's written this book, and I just wanted briefly to acknowledge some of the books that were inspirational to me as I was starting to do this research project for my master's thesis on Asian American Buddhists. So along with Carolyn, Sharon Su, who I was also able to do an event with at Elliott Bay Books in Seattle, wrote this ethnography of Korean American Buddhists. And she, actually, most Korean Americans, by and large, are Christian. So this is why the title is Being Buddhist in a Christian World. And Sharon really looks at the dynamics, also especially of gender in these communities. And what I noticed in both of these books was that they mentioned they didn't see a lot of young adults here in these communities. And I noticed the same thing in this book by Wendy Cadge, where she looked at both a Thai American Buddhist community and a predominantly white convert insight Buddhist community. And also in Jian Mingbao's book, Creating a Buddhist Community at this Thai temple. So there's some mention of youth throughout these books, but what made me curious is that they weren't exactly central. It seemed that sometimes they didn't always feel entirely at home at these temples, maybe again, because of a language barrier, or maybe they had other things to do, or maybe they, felt kind of embarrassed. Maybe there was pressure at school to be Christian or to just fit in. And sometimes it's just not so fun to sign up for being, on top of being a racial minority, also a religious minority. And so when I was writing my book, I was inspired by these two anthologies by Sumi London Kim, who I guess at the time she was Sumi London before she married her husband, Hwan Soo Kim. And Sumi likes to remind people that she herself is white, though her kids are mixed race, but that her parents were Buddhist in the 60s and 70s, and hence the name Sumi. So Blue Jean Buddha actually had a pretty good representation of Asian American Buddhists, and seeing the way that Sumi was able to reach out in this kind of networked way, in a decentralized way. In other words, she wasn't just going to one temple or one meditation center and getting voices, but actually just asking friends to encourage other friends to speak with her for this anthology. So I actually took the same approach when doing the research for my books, just trying to cast a wide net and saying, hey, anyone who wants to talk to me, if you're of full or partial Asian heritage, if you feel connected to Buddhism in some way, I'd love to talk to you. I'd love to learn more. And yeah, so this is another event that really centered the second generation Asian American Buddhist experience with the Boca youth group. So this was an event that I was able to do with John Gill and Wan Wan Lu and Andy, all of whom are in Be the Refuge. And so I thought, in lieu of me explaining what the Boca Youth Group is, I would just show this little 1.5 minute trailer from Wan Wan's really beautiful documentary, which is called Youth Group. And it's about this Buddhist youth group in Southern California that I write about in part 2 of my book. So again, I'm going to stop sharing for the PowerPoint briefly and turn to the video.
It started maybe 6th, 7th grade. My mom just had me go.
When Buddhism came to China, as like when Buddhism comes to like all manner of other places, it changes every culture that it goes to, and it is changed by every culture that it goes to.
The congregation is of a certain generation, and it might not be something that translates quite as easily to youth. What's kind of special is that the volunteers who are running the organization we were that youth at one point.
Always praying for
peaceful, for safety, and for healthy.
What I never understood was who was going to do that.
You can't make a kid do the chant and like bow because it's so weird.
Do we chant in youth group? Yeah, we do.
Yeah.
We chant every single Sunday. We do an offering chant before we eat our meals.
I don't feel like I'm Buddhist because I don't put any effort into it or any work. And the work and effort I'm talking about is like chants and meditation. It's just hard to call myself Buddhist without doing anything at all. Yeah, I don't know.
Help out every weekend at the youth group?
I help out every, yes.
So can you all hear me? Yes? Okay, great. Yeah, I love that documentary so much. And that's why I wove it really into part 2 of my book as much as I can. But of course, the written word never quite, does as much as this video can. So I'm happy to be able to watch a little clip of it with you. And then the final video for this section, I just wanted to show a brief clip from Mihiri's documentary that she made back in, oh gosh, I think almost a decade ago now, called I Take Refuge. So Mihiri is, you recognize her name since she's one of the new associate editors at Lion's Roar, and she's also a Sri Lankan American Sinhalese Buddhist. So she did this documentary focused on the experiences of 1.5 and second generation Sri Lankan American Buddhists in her community. And I decided to choose just this screen capture because as I was talking to Nalika, who's also Sri Lankan, but she primarily grew up in Sri Lanka and came to America later, but she was just saying how touched she was by this scene because to her, it felt very American because the monk was serving the kids food. And she was saying, oh, in Sri Lanka, you wouldn't see this, right? We serve the monks there, like we offer food to the monks. But so I'll show the clip again. So bear with me as we do the switch to the other setting.
There was never another place or another temple that I would rather go to than a Crenshaw one because that's where I grew up. That's the temple I knew. Not just because I had childhood memories there, but also because of my grandparents investing so much of their time there.
The earliest memories that come up are just sitting in front of the, big golden Buddha that we have at Dharma Vijaya Buddhist Vihara, and interacting with the monks. Definitely like Vesak ceremonies and like banquet of food that they had for everyone. and having to take off your shoes countless times and on and off. And,
I remember going to Sunday school and being with other children around my same age, Sinhala children, which was something that was kind of unusual because in most other settings, I was, one of a kind. In a way, there's kind of like a very familial relationship there. Just, building relationships with the monks, knowing them to kind of be like an uncle in a way, and then seeking some of those monks out on my own time.
And so
So Mihiri's documentary was certainly another one of the many strands that I was able to weave into my book, and also just reading her incredible master's thesis, which is pictured here. So then part 3 of my book, which I call Integrators, is focused on the experiences of convert Asian American Buddhists, or first gen American Buddhists. And first gen is a phrase I'm borrowing from one of my interviewees, Noah Alumet. And he calls himself a first gen Buddhist because he's the first generation in his family to be Buddhist in America, having been raised Catholic, and he's Filipino American. So the quote here is from Holly. It says, Buddhists like myself face challenges in integrating and expressing multiple cultural identities as young American, Buddhist, and Asian. Yet I think we are all moving toward a more pluralistic world in which multiplicity of identity will be the norm. So some recent events that really focused on Asian Americans in convert communities. Just yesterday, I was with the AAPI Sangha in LA, which is actually led by Noel Alumit, who I just mentioned. He's in the book. It was just, most of these people in this group actually practice in predominantly white convert communities. And they talked about how it does feel important to be able to have affinity groups as well, to be able to process just some of the dynamics that come up, some of the difficulties. For those of us who weren't raised Buddhist, it's sometimes, all very new to us. But then if we enter Buddhism through predominantly white communities, and sometimes these communities don't always, as Annie mentioned at the very beginning of our time together, don't always acknowledge the roots of where these practices come from, or might say things that really feel offensive in a way that kind of seems to insinuate that Asian American Buddhists are kind of doing an inferior kind of practice. There's unfortunately too many stories of that nature. And so I've been really grateful to be able to be in conversation, for example, here, Ancient Dragon Zen Gate, like many, I've zoomed into a few Zen communities now. They've all been really wonderful and warm and inviting. And it was a real treat to be able to talk with Howard for this event, since typically people of Asian descent are actually few and far between in these predominantly white convert sanghas as well. And another event was just to be able to zoom into the IMS teacher training program. I think they recently graduated, so congratulations to this cohort at the Insight Meditation Society in Massachusetts, really grounded in the Insight tradition. And in many ways, I'd say for many decades from the 60s and 70s onward, that tradition was really dominated by white, even male voices. But we can see that there are really efforts now to diversify the teachers, and this cohort is 75% BIPOC and also has diversity in other ways in terms of gender or sexuality, or also socioeconomic class and so forth. So it's really an honor to be able to speak with this BIPOC community as well. And then finally, the fourth part of my book really weaves together voices from the previous 3 parts. And this part of the book is called Refuge Makers. So those of you who've read the book know that it's very much indebted to Erin Lee, whom I'll acknowledge just in a few minutes as I wrap up this portion of our time together. But this quote is from Erin. While we still need to articulate our principles, relay our stories, protest injustice, and cast our votes, we are most compelling when we are the very refuges we wish to see in this world. So I just wanted to celebrate the Buddhist community at Stanford, which I was at as an undergrad back when it was much smaller as a community. And the co-leaders, Elaine Lai, Julian Butterfield, and Karan Cross have just done a really beautiful job of nurturing this very diverse Sangha. So they actually came first to mind when I thought of Refuge Makers. Just in the fall of last year, we read this book, Radical Dharma, together, and Lama Rod Owens came to speak on his book, Love and Rage. And then they had a reading group so that we were all able to read this together. And I've also been thinking about actually really the first unofficial book event I did all the way back in October, a few months before the book came out, was with Reverend Senju Earthling Manuel, who some of you may also know. She published this beautiful book recently, The Deepest Peace. And it was really just an honor to be in conversation with her. And I'm also very much looking forward to a conversation with Brisha Wade, who's wrote this book, Grieving While Black. Actually, we have the same publisher, so that felt like a kind of special connection. And she also has trained as a chaplain and does work with chaplaincy and grief. And I just highlight these events because, you know, my book does end on this chapter called Solidarity. And it's a reminder to me that Asian American Buddhists, this identity is kind of a lens and a platform or a place from which we can actually connect out to so many other different communities, as the May 4th gathering did, and also as these different events show that we have so much to learn in dialogue and community with each other. So I'm looking at the time, and I think I will just very briefly go through these next few slides. So if you'll bear with me for just a few more minutes. I wanted to go actually even further back in time. So I just highlighted the last 3 months of 2021, and I wanted to go back almost a year to around March 2020, when really the COVID really hit the US, right? Although already in Asia, we were aware of it. And my partner Trent and I were living in Bangkok at the time. And when we landed, here in San Francisco, thinking we'd be here for just a month. Of course, we haven't left since. We never made it back to Thailand. But when we landed, one of my friends said, stay safe, both from the virus and the racism. And it was kind of a shocking way to arrive back in the US. For much of the last presidency, we actually lived in Cambodia and Thailand. We weren't based in the US. And so what I came back to was statistics on how worried Asian Americans from across ethnic backgrounds are about being the victims of hate crimes. I also came back to, you know, the murder of George Floyd, and also then the activism that arose from that, the kind of incredible, I think, how to term it, I mean, the raising up of consciousness of conversations now about race in this country, about the heavy racial karma that we've inherited. So here we see Buddhists for Black Lives Matter, a protest, a silent march that was held in Los Angeles. And David Wu is going to be one of the speakers in this series, so I wanted to highlight him too. He was one of the co-organizers of this. You know, I also was really amazed to see more in the Insight community, more affinity groups. This is not something 15 years ago I was seeing, right? Even affinity groups focused on the Desi community, people from India, and people, I think a lot of us are feeling in our hearts so concerned about India, about the COVID situation there. And so it was just striking to think about, you know, at that time, this was when, this is more recent in March, but just to see like almost more granular affinity groups, reminding ourselves even Asian Americans are not a monolith. Asian American Buddhists are not a monolith. So there was that. And then there was also the vandalization of Buddhist temples in Little Saigon. It was just so much to take in during this time of relative isolation. You know, also Anne will be speaking in this series in the coming months, but here was another controversy, not about the desecration of statues or of temples per se, but still about something that can be very painful, this sort of cultural appropriation. It's a topic that's hotly debated that we could have a whole other presentation on. But for me to see in Literary Hub, a major literary magazine, An's voice, talking about the controversy around a book that was claimed to be a translation of the poetry of Buddhist nuns. And I won't go into it in too much detail here, but I think just to see these issues lifted in a more public way, to see more people discussing this was really powerful for me. And then, of course, it was incredibly heartbreaking to learn about Konwicha Ratanapakdi, his assault that led to his death. And this is a picture of his daughter holding a photo of her father at Wat Nagara Dhamma. Actually, my partner has spent a lot of time at this temple, which serves Thai and Cambodian and Laotian American Buddhists. So we were able to go and pay our respects to the temple just a couple months ago. It was our first time stepping foot actually in a Buddhist temple since the pandemic began, which is really, really moving for me. And then, of course, the vandalization of Higashi Honganji, where the May 4th event was held. But to me, this graphic by Rob Sato, again, the same person who did our May 4th, May We Gather graphic, really spoke to me. It was a reminder that the lanterns may have been toppled, but then together as a community, we came together and lifted those lanterns. We restored, we came together to repair. You know, and then of course, Atlanta, that was all just in this past year. It's kind of overwhelming to think about that. The video that we were able to screen a part of during the May 4th, May We Gather ceremony. And just, it was really moving for me to think, here are two sons of Young Ayu, right? The sons of a Korean American immigrant mother and a Black father, talking about what it's like to be both Black and Asian in this country that has such long histories, centuries of discrimination, and how their mom, though, always taught them to respect people and stand up against discrimination, stand up for what is right. And just so moving when this is the moment Robert talks about finding out that it was his mom who was one of the people killed in those shootings. So I'm going to move us back in time just a little bit more. This is a period from 2016 to 2020 where I primarily lived in Cambodia, in Thailand, in Phnom Penh, and Bangkok. For the first time in my life, I was living in a country where I was a racial majority and a religious majority. I shouldn't say for the first time in my life. I was born in China, but I left when I was 4. So for the first time in my life that I could remember. And I just wanted to show this picture of, in Bangkok, of Wat Sutat, a temple with these incredible 3-story tall Buddhist murals. And here we can see the Parita thread, this thread that we saw in the May 4th ceremony. You know, while I was in Bangkok, Duncan's book came out in February 2019 on the Day of Remembrance. This is a day commemorating the day when Japanese Americans in California were rounded up to go to the camps. Before Bangkok, we were living in Phnom Penh, and this was just, you know, right down the street from us, these Buddhist temples. And it made me think that if I'm going to dismiss Asian Buddhists or Asian practices of chanting and ritual, I'm dismissing millions upon millions of people. It's not a tenable way to think about Buddhism. And so my time here in Cambodia and Thailand really also deepened just my admiration and respect for the countless millions of people that we are connected to as American Buddhists that have stewarded and shaped this religion over centuries, them and their families. And so by way of ending, just by closing, I do want to acknowledge Aaron Lee, the angry Asian Buddhist, who died, I think, on the second to last day that we were living in Phnom Penh. I came back and was just able to attend his memorial ceremony, which Be the Refuge opens with. The picture of Funi and me and Aaron. We were able to visit him just a couple months before he passed. We talked about John Kwan, this Korean nun who makes amazing food. So that's in the book as well. Some of you may realize Aaron said, I just want to eat those shiitake mushrooms forever. So let's see, I'm going to skip because I think we're running a little bit low on time. This is just some photos from my time actually in Taiwan, where I lived before Cambodia. I was able to spend a semester at a Buddhist college there. And it's actually in Taiwan that I wrote my first really major article about Asian American Buddhists all the way back in 2016. So this is all just connecting the dots in retrospect, all the many things that went into making this book possible. Photo of Gabrielle, who we saw quoted earlier. And right after I published this article in Buddha Dharma, Funi also published an article urging us to really honor the roots of Asian American Buddhism with these historical photos. So Aaron on his blog, Angry Asian Buddhist, just had pictures of both of the magazines. He got the print copies and he was celebrating that. Here I'm just also wanting to celebrate. We read a quote from Thich Nhat Hanh from Tay at the very beginning of this, of our time together here. That quote is from this book, Dharma, Color and Culture. And sorry, it's a little bit cut off here, but one of my inspirations, obviously among many, many inspirations for this book, is this pamphlet called Making the Invisible Visible, very apropos for this series, written all the way back in 2000. There were so many different voices, including, an anonymous Chinese American practitioner whom I quote in my book. So yeah, Aaron began by writing, here he is, Arun Likati. John is John Gill, who we saw in the youth group of Kudos in Oz, who've chosen to remain anonymous, but they're woven in my book as well. They started a group blog, and then Aaron started the Angry Asian Buddhist blog. And then when he got cancer, right before he passed in 2017, he started a new blog, and he titled it Be the Refuge. And he titled it Be the Refuge because he wanted us to think about what it means to be a refuge for ourselves and others, for all beings, the many, many creative ways we can do that. And actually for a very long time, I couldn't figure out the title for my book. So you could say I was very good at missing the obvious, as I mentioned in my book. And I just wanted to close here with this from 2014, when Aaron said, Happy Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. And he created this collage of Asian American Buddhist faces. And I'm thinking, if we did the same collage now, there'd be so many faces. I think I could have slide upon slide of faces. So I just want to end here, since it is APA Heritage Month or APITA Heritage Month, AA. There are many ways to call this month, which itself is a testament to how diverse our community is, how it's not a monolith. So I'm sorry for going a little bit over time. I think we still have about 20 minutes for questions. And I appreciate all of you for just joining me in this experiment of listening, of sharing these videos together and looking at all of these images together.
Thank you, Chenzing, so much. If this was an experiment, I can't imagine what something that isn't an experiment. It must be amazing, even more amazing. This was wonderful, and you covered so much in your talk. It was so rich and so beautiful and so moving. And I want to leave time for people who are here to ask questions. So I think that I'll just say that I learned about, I have been practicing in an Asian tradition for over 20 years, and I had not really thought about or heard much about American Asian Buddhists until Funi spoke at a Buddhist Peace Fellowship Block Build B camp some years ago. And so it really is invisible in a lot of ways, and I'm so appreciating that we can help to make it more visible to, especially to white Buddhists or convert Buddhists or whatever we are calling them. I would like to actually get more clarity on the terminology at some point if we have time. So I'll just open the floor. So if you wanted to put a question in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, I see there's just lots of gratitude in the chat right now, but if anyone has a question to put in the chat, or feel free to unmute and ask your question directly. Thank you.
I'm just reviewing the chats too, and I just wanted to say my deep apologies for not turning on the closed captioning for the videos. I'm sincerely sorry for that, and hopefully there's a way after the fact that we can put them back in. So I'm very sorry. Thank you all for bearing with me with the kind of technical challenges of giving a presentation like this.
Well, maybe since no one's asking a question, I will ask that question about terminology. Oh, here comes someone. Okay, good. All right, let's see. I'm curious what reaction or responses, this is from La, dominant culture, teachers, sanghas have had to your book. Great. And there's a couple more questions. I don't know if you want to look at them all first. Or there's one more question, I guess. Okay, the idea of Asian American and Asian Pacific Islander being paired together. Is there an issue that Asian Americans may be more prominent than APIs in that grouping? So those are the two questions open. I don't know if you want to take those in time, however you'd like.
Sure. Thanks so much, La, for your question. Let me see. Okay. About dominant culture teachers and sanghas. I think so far, yeah, I've heard some feedback from people that they have appreciated this book. I would say that it has been eye-opening for them to think about. I don't know if I've heard from too many teachers and sanghas. I guess I just feel very fortunate that I felt very welcomed to all of these different spaces. I recognize, I think I want to point out that even among Asian Americans, we don't always, people who are raised, let's say Joroshin, don't always necessarily get to connect with second gen or, first gen Asian American convert Buddhists. So I think from these dominant Sangha spaces, certainly I hear from Asian American practitioners feeling a lot of gratitude of being seen and heard and acknowledged. And then also people saying that the book maybe has caused them to, it's kind of reckoning to take pause and think about, what are some of the ways maybe inadvertently even that my communities have contributed to the erasure or marginalization of Asian American Buddhists. So I'm really moved to see that the book is sparking conversations. I didn't design the cover, but when I saw this cover, I just thought, oh, this is perfect because this is precisely what I hope it does, right? The book is a starting point. It doesn't even come close to capturing the full breadth of everything that could make up Asian American Buddhism, but it's a start, and it seems like it's starting to spark conversations in these communities. And then, okay, I see a question from Keith. Thank you. Good to see you here. By custom and from a transnational perspective, it seems not uncommon that Asian American, Asian Pacific Islander are paired together. Although there does appear to be affinity and common issue, solidarity, is there any issue that Asian Americans may be more prominent than APIs in that grouping? Does that generate a form of co-opting, marginalization, and erasure of APIs, which may be of a concern? Yeah, I'm really glad you bring this up, Keith. I think it is true that Asian American often is just reduced to East Asian. I mean, even South Asians can feel excluded, which is why we see sometimes APIDA, which acknowledges Desis, but actually even the term Desi can be seen to exclude Sri Lankans. And so all of this terminology is really contested. And I think that's healthy and as it should be, that we need to think deeply about these issues. So I've been kind of involved with a group that's trying to put together an AAPI Buddhist retreat or bring us together more. And we're having a lot of debates about this terminology because statistically speaking, not a lot of people in the Pacific Islander are of Buddhist heritage compared to, people of some other Asian backgrounds. And so we also want to be careful not to just name them in this sort of sense of like shallow inclusion or almost a tokenizing inclusion, when in fact they may not want to be, part of this particular space, right? So I think that if we are to include AAPI, I think it's very important to include them and also to acknowledge the ways Asian Americans, their sort of dominance within different ethnic groups, like I feel Chinese Americans or East Asians like myself are in some ways like more represented than Southeast Asians, South Asians. We don't hear those voices nearly as much as I would like to.
There's two more great questions in the chat. If you want to look from either AMVU or MVU, and then also Yenkei.
Yes, so nice to see both of you. Let's see. So Asian Americans practicing Buddhism have been very visible to our individual and group experiences, but not in the greater white and non-Asian Buddhist practicing communities. In fact, there has been blowback when Asian Americans have spoken out. Yeah, that's really true. In your interviews, were there experiences of repair after non-Asian majority white Buddhists have expressed hostility towards the needs or reckoning of harm against Asian and Asian American Buddhists? You know, to be honest, my interviews now feel like such a long time ago, right? Almost a decade ago. And so I think that I'm not sure we talked so much about repair. I think we were still just beginning to explore what were even the issues. And some people were bothered by this lack of representation. Some people weren't really bothered, like there was just a wide spectrum of opinion. But I think some of that repair and reckoning is happening more so now. And I think it really helps that we're more able to find each other now as Asian American Buddhists, even just to articulate that identity. I mean, lots of people I interviewed were saying, I've never even like heard the phrase Asian American Buddhist. I've never thought about the intersection of these two identities, even though of course I've thought about being Asian American and of course I've thought about being Buddhist, but I've just never thought about the pairing of these two. And Yankui, you ask, can you comment on any cross-cultural fertilization of Buddhism? For example, the emphasis on meditation in white convert Buddhism in the US and secularization of mindfulness meditation. Is that happening in Asian Buddhist countries? Is that seen as westernization there or something endogenous modernization of Buddhism there? Yes, that's a really big question, but cross-cultural, transnational, these sorts of flows and connections very much, you know, always happening. I mean, American Buddhism is a transnational Buddhism. The very insight practices we practice are shaped by Burmese, Thai, by Buddhist modernizers in Asia who also interacted with the West. And so I don't know, there's not really such a thing, I think, as a pure white Buddhism or even really a pure Asian or Asian American Buddhism. That's certainly not what my book is arguing for, but rather my book, and I hope my work, helps us be more culturally engaged Buddhists, people who are engaging with the many cultures that shape us. And some of these cultures may not be so visible to us, right? But even I think as we see more people do land acknowledgements, we recognize that how much, where our debts are owed, how interconnected we are. We are learning about cultures that very much affect or shape or, you know, have stewarded the very land on which we stand. And yes, I think it was interesting. I showed briefly a picture of my time at Dharma Drum in Taiwan, and they were adopting mindfulness kind of from the US, MBSR. So that was really fascinating to me to see this kind of like ricocheting effect. I think people could write books on this or theses on this. So I don't want to speculate more, but I think very much Asian people in Asia are also aware of the West. And, you know, I'm not sure to what extent they're completely aware of like Buddhist communities in the West, but I also know that for our May 4th gathering, people were tuning in all the way from Asia, waking up very early to be in community with us together.
And that leads us to Louise's question about whether we will have more ceremonies like this, which I think is just a really important question because that ceremony was so nourishing for so many people, as you said. I think 4,000 people watched it after 700 live. I mean, that's ridiculous. So I think it's a great question. If we're going to you'll be doing those, or anyone will keep doing those.
Yeah, we hope people continue to gather. So we have to see, you know, and I think that we all have to do a part, right? Like be the refuge, create the kinds of spaces and gatherings that you want to see. I think of, you know, this time together has been an experiment. May 4th was an experiment. Whether we feel moved by that experiment partly depends, maybe in a way I can say the success, if we will, of that experiment depends on how many more people are inspired to create those gatherings. So yeah, Funi and Duncan and I are in ongoing conversation and very much welcoming feedback from the community, but we also recognize there are so many other people out there in the community with the skills and the gifts to also create these gatherings. And so I hope we can find each other and do this in an ongoing way so that, you know, this doesn't just happen once a year in LA, that it can happen many, many times and all over the US, all over America, you know, all over the West.
Thank you. And there's another question from Keith in the chat, if you'd like to read that.
We all change based on our actions, experiences, and the passage of time. Since Be the Refuge was launched in January, to what extent, if any, have your perspectives reflected in the book changed? Thanks, Keith. Yeah, this feels like a very contemplative, reflective session today, which is kind of a treat. I don't often get to do that. I still feel like I'm so much in it that I almost need other people to tell me, how I'm changing. But I think that something that's really been highlighted for me or mirrored for me in a lot of events is people are just reminding me. There have been some people who've actually been offended by the book or felt it was there was anger in it and they didn't feel like that really resonated with their Buddhist practice. And I just want to recognize and honor and respect that. Obviously, no book is for everybody, but what's been reflected back to me is actually just the heart of spiritual friendship in the book and a heart of really love, that the book really comes from the place of love. Even just preparing this presentation today, I was just tearing up thinking about all of the many people whom I'm deeply indebted to, my parents, my family, my friends, my spiritual teachers, so many. I grabbed some of my favorite books by Thich Nhat Hanh, some of old classics, Lotus in a Sea of Fire and Fragrant Palm Leaves, and so The Novice. And we have a very large shelf. We basically have like a whole shelf of Tay's books, so he is one of many, many Buddhist teachers who have influenced me. And I think just what's changed, Keith, for me is just like this feeling of almost like overwhelming gratitude of just how interconnected we are. Like a dream of my book was to have something like May 4th. Like I wasn't sure if we'd ever see something like that off the page and in the person. And then to actually see it and be fortunate enough to be there. I don't know, it's very humbling. So I feel very much a kind of overwhelming sense of gratitude and and I think that's transformed some of certainly the isolation and the loneliness and the confusion that was also, part of the story of this book, part of the spark, part of but I think it just helps me appreciate how to fuel our movements, right? Anger is in this book, but it's not the fuel for this book. Love is the fuel for this book. This book would never have been written without it.
Thank you so much. We have about 5 more minutes, so if anyone's been sitting on a question or comment or anything you'd like to share in the chat or by unmuting and speaking out, this is your chance. Please do.
You have another question, Chancing. I don't know if you want to read it from Gary Gatt. And yes.
Sure. Sure. Thank you, Gary, for being here. Any words of support for Asian Americans feeling fear, grief on a daily basis? Just, I think so simply that you're not alone and you're deeply cared for. And I think for Asian American Buddhists, just to watch that ceremony and the May 4th ceremony, just to remember again, more than 1,700 people were there live. To me, that was a manifestation of how we belong in this country and also we belong to each other. We were showing that by showing up. And even when we can't physically be together, I think actually Buddhist teachings help remind us that in sort of magical, unfathomable ways, we are so connected across geography, across time, across space. So I think my words of support are just really wanting them to remember that and remember the strength of their ancestors, of their heritage, of our ancestors, of our heritage. And there's so much support out there. So don't be afraid to reach out and ask for help.
Thank you. And I guess we'll just go to wrapping up unless there's any last burning questions or comments. And just to say that, of course, that this practice, this whole community of making visible grew out of our practice in the tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh. And so we are grateful to all of the ancestors in Asia that carried this practice on for so many hundreds and hundreds of years, and that, you know, without that we wouldn't be able to be here practicing. And for me personally, and I think for a lot of people on this call, this practice has been life-saving. And so yeah, so just so grateful. So thank you.
Thank you, Shanti. Thank you so much
Yes.
for being here tonight. And thank you everyone for being here tonight with us. As we always say, we are here learning together. And this is a space for that, for learn together, for healing together, and a space for healing together. And thank you so much everyone for being here. And I guess we are gonna close right now with the bell, Annie, and then we will have some announcements about our next sessions in this topic, which we didn't, I don't remember if we mentioned that at the beginning, but Shenzhen is curating this series. We have three sessions of the series, and she approached our next speaker. So thank you so much for that, Shenzhen.
Yes, we will make that announcement after the bell. So we'll just invite the bell to finish. And from the time that we've spent here together, may all of us here and all beings everywhere have ease and freedom and safety and well-being and joy. And may our time together in some way lead to the healing and awakening of the whole world. And may we continue on this path together, learning and growing and loving. And may all beings be free from suffering and the root causes of suffering. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So yes, we have 2 more webinars in this series, and you'll be getting more information on email about those. We have June 23rd, I believe, and July 28th, if I'm not wrong.
Yes, June 23rd, David Wu, and July 28th, Anne Tran.
Yes, thank you. So please join us for those. Chenzing, do you have anything you'd like to say as we wrap up?
Just thank you all so much. I'm so moved that you're all here, and you know, I'm very easy to contact through my website. So I hope we can just continue these bonds of spiritual friendship together.
Yes. Yes.